Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back into one of the strangest, saddest, and most avoidable disasters in medical history. So, grab your blanket, turn down the brightness, and let's talk about the pill that was supposed to make people sleep, but ended up haunting generations. We're talking about thalidomide, the so-called wonder drug, the pill that promised to calm your nerves, help you rest, ease morning sickness, and make life a little softer in a stressful post-war world. And then, of course, it did the complete opposite, because why not? If you've ever wondered how a drug could go from safe for everyone to banned across the planet in just a few short years, this story will gently take you there, step by step, decade by decade, mistake by mistake. It's a quiet, slow unraveling of trust, greed, and human optimism. Or maybe just human laziness, depending on how generous you're feeling tonight. So, dim the lights, breathe. Let's begin in a sleepy little lab in West Germany, -1953, a drug with no purpose. The company was called Grunenthal. If you've never heard of them, don't worry. They weren't exactly a household name, unless your household was full of chemists with a questionable sense of ethics. The company had been founded shortly after World War II, when Germany was rebuilding, and people were desperate for new industries that weren't directly tied to, bombs. Grunenthal started small, mostly making antibiotics and painkillers. But like every pharmaceutical company of the era, they were on the hunt for something big, something that could be sold to everyone. Ideally, something addictive but socially acceptable. Sleep aids were the perfect target. Post-war, Europe was tense. Millions were anxious, traumatized, and not sleeping very well. So, in 1953, one of their chemists, Heinrich Mukhtar, synthesized a new compound called thalidomide. And yes, the name sounds weirdly calm, like something a spa might sell to balance your aura. But Mukhtar wasn't exactly a Zen herbalist. He was a scientist who had, during the war, reportedly been involved in testing typhus vaccines on prisoners at concentration camps. That's not a great resume entry, but somehow he ended up running research at Grunenthal, because apparently West Germany had a very forgiving hiring policy in the 1950s. Anyway, Mukhtar's new compound was a mystery. No one really knew what it was supposed to do. It didn't seem to kill bacteria. It didn't relieve pain. It didn't do much of anything. But it had one interesting property in lab animals. It made them really relaxed, like comically so. So the company decided, fine, let's sell it as a sedative. Because if you can't figure out what a chemical does, just call it a calming agent. That always sells. The age of tranquilizers. To understand how thalidomide even got on the market, you have to picture the 1950s pharmaceutical scene. It was the Wild West, but with lab coats. Drug regulation was basically a suggestion, and safety testing was minimal. Companies could launch new drugs with little more than an internal memo and a confident sales pitch. And this was the golden age of the tranquilizer. Valium, Librium, barbiturates, they were all being thrown at the public like candy. Are you nervous? Take this. Can't sleep? Try to. Depressed? Don't worry, you're not depressed, you're just chemically inconvenient. So, when Grunenthal came along with a non-barbiturate sleeping pill that was supposedly non-addictive and completely safe, doctors were thrilled. Finally, a sedative you could give to anyone, children, pregnant women, whoever. Because apparently, logic took a vacation in the 1950s. The company called it Contagun in Germany, and marketed it as completely harmless, even for mothers and infants. And people believed it. They even advertised it with pictures of happy pregnant women and cozy bedtime scenes. Because nothing says safety like a smiling woman holding her baby while swallowing an untested chemical. Spreading the dream by the late 1950s, thalidomide was spreading across Europe under dozens of brand names, Distavel in the UK, Softenin in other countries, and eventually, samples even made their way to Canada, Australia, and parts of Asia. In total, it would appear in nearly 50 countries. The pill was everywhere. Doctors loved it, patients adored it, and no one, literally no one, was asking serious questions. The drug was being handed out like Tic Tacs, often without prescriptions, and the company's marketing department worked overtime to make sure it stayed that way. They even sent representatives to hospitals, gifting free samples to obstetricians. Because what could possibly go wrong with a completely safe drug in the hands of every pregnant woman in Europe? Quite a lot, actually. The first signs, it started quietly. As it always does, a few doctors here and there noticed something strange. Patients who took thalidomide were reporting tingling in their hands and feet. Some even lost feeling altogether. It seemed like nerve damage, but mild, temporary, nothing to panic about, right? Then came something harder to ignore. By 1959 and 1960, hospitals began to notice a sudden spike in newborns with bizarre limb deformities. Babies were being born with arms and legs that were shortened, twisted, or missing entirely. Some had hands that sprouted directly from their shoulders, like little flippers. Others had malformed ears, eyes, or internal organs. It was devastating, but at first, no one connected it to thalidomide. Doctors assumed it was just bad luck, or maybe radiation exposure, or maybe something in the water. The idea that a simple sedative could cause it seemed absurd. After all, the company had said it was non-toxic. They had animal studies. Everything looked fine. Except it wasn't. A missing step. Here's the thing. Grunenthal's safety testing was a joke. They had done basic tests on rats and mice, but no tests on pregnant animals. Which, might have been a good idea before marketing it as safe for morning sickness. But at the time, regulations didn't require it. So, they didn't bother. And when doctors started reporting nerve damage, the company brushed it off as rare side effects. When birth defects began showing up, they claimed coincidence. They insisted thalidomide couldn't possibly be responsible. It was too mild, too harmless. They even doubled down on advertising, claiming it was safe enough to give to a baby. Because if you're going to deny something, might as well go all in. The British boom in the United Kingdom. Thalidomide was distributed by a company called Distillers, which, ironically, was better known for making whiskey. Because who better to handle pharmaceuticals than people who specialize in alcohol? Distillers marketed thalidomide as Distavel and spent a fortune promoting it. They called it a completely safe sedative for mothers and children. British doctors handed it out by the thousands. Pregnant women loved it because it actually worked for nausea, at least for a while. The drug soothed the stomach, calmed the nerves, and made you pleasantly sleepy. It felt like magic. Until babies started arriving with missing limbs. At first, no one could see the connection, but patterns began emerging. Mothers who had taken thalidomide early in pregnancy were the ones affected. Their babies were born with phacomelia, a rare condition that caused severely shortened limbs. The word literally means sea-like limbs, which sounds poetic until you realize how tragic it was. Thousands of infants across Europe were being born this way, and still, the companies denied it. Entered Dr. Lenz. Finally, someone started paying attention. His name was Dr. Widukind Lenz, a German pediatrician and geneticist. He began noticing a sharp increase in babies with these strange deformities, far too many for coincidence. He interviewed mothers, reviewed medical histories, and kept seeing the same name pop up, Contagon. By late 1961, he was convinced thalidomide was the cause. He contacted Grunenthal, urging them to pull the drug immediately. They ignored him. He contacted health authorities. They hesitated. Bureaucracy moved slower than molasses. So, Lenz went public. He spoke at medical conferences. He warned colleagues. He made noise, polite, scientific noise, but noise nonetheless. And that made all the difference. In December 1961, under mounting pressure and bad publicity, Grunenthal finally withdrew Contagon from the market. By then, the damage was done. Estimates vary, but around 10,000 babies were affected worldwide, and at least half died shortly after birth. The rest lived with lifelong disabilities, and that's just the officially recorded cases. The American close call across the Atlantic. Thalidomide almost repeated its tragedy, but didn't. And the reason it didn't is basically one woman, Dr. Frances Kelsey. Kelsey was a medical officer at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And in 1960 she was assigned to review an application from the William S. Merrill Company to sell thalidomide under the name Kevidon. The company expected a rubber stamp. Approvals usually took weeks, but Kelsey wasn't convinced. She thought the safety data was flimsy, too many unanswered questions, too little evidence. She refused to approve it, over and over, for months, despite constant pressure. Her bosses got annoyed. The company complained. She stood her ground. And when the European disaster became public, she was proven right. The US had narrowly avoided joining the catastrophe, all thanks to one stubborn scientist who actually read the data. Kelsey later received the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service from John F. Kennedy, who probably said something like, "Thanks for saving us from ourselves." And honestly, he wasn't wrong. A slow awakening. When the truth about thalidomide finally broke, the world was horrified. Photos of affected children appeared in newspapers. Lawsuits began piling up. Governments scrambled to respond. It wasn't just about one bad drug anymore. It was about the entire system. People started asking how this could happen, how a company could sell a drug without proper testing, how regulators could look the other way, how doctors could prescribe something safe without any evidence. The scandal shattered public trust in the pharmaceutical industry, and in many ways, it built the system we have today. Drug approval laws became stricter. Testing requirements expanded. Pregnant women were suddenly excluded from most clinical trials, which solved one problem and created a few others. But that's a story for another night. The survivors, the children who survived thalidomide, grew up with missing or malformed limbs, often facing years of surgeries and social stigma. Many became activists, artists, or advocates. Some sued and won small settlements. Others received lifelong care funds. But nothing could really undo what had happened. For them, the word miracle drug had a bitter taste, and the name thalidomide became shorthand for corporate negligence, the pharmaceutical industry's original sin. Let us drift a little deeper next time into how governments tried to clean up the mess, how the company dodged real punishment, and how, unbelievably, thalidomide made a comeback decades later. Because apparently, history loves a sequel. So, the year is 1962. The world has just woken up to one of the biggest medical disasters in modern history. Newspapers are filled with photos of babies born without limbs, and the word thalidomide has become an international synonym for corporate greed and scientific failure. Germany is panicking. Britain is panicking. Australia is quietly panicking, and Grunenthal, the company that made thalidomide, is pretending to be slightly surprised that giving an untested drug to pregnant women caused mass deformities. Because of course they were. The public outrage was immediate, but oddly calm, like a slow burn of disbelief. This wasn't a war crime. It wasn't a dictator. It was a pill. A tiny, harmless-looking pill that people trusted, and that somehow made it worse. The tragedy felt domestic, like it had happened in everyone's own home. The company that wouldn't say sorry. Kemi Grunenthal's first instinct wasn't to apologize. It was to defend. Their lawyers released statements saying there was no proven link between thalidomide and the birth defects, which, by late 1961, was like saying there was no proven link between falling off a cliff and hitting the ground. Behind the scenes, they were trying to minimize the damage and protect their executives. The company's chief scientist, Heinrich Mukhtar, quietly kept his job. So did most of the management team. Nobody was fired. No one was arrested. In fact, for years, the company operated as if nothing had happened. They even continued selling other drugs under different names. Public relations at the time were, let's say, creative. Grunenthal's press releases were full of vague empathy but zero accountability. They referred to the children as victims of an unfortunate coincidence, which sounds like something you'd say after spilling coffee, not after disabling thousands of newborns. And yet, because of the legal system's sluggishness in Germany, its own discomfort with putting post-war scientists on trial again, the company managed to drag things out for years. The trial that barely happened by 1968, public pressure finally forced the government to take action. A criminal case was opened against several Grunenthal executives, including Mukhtar. The charges, negligent homicide and bodily harm. The trial took place in Okan, and it lasted 2 years, 2 full years. But it ended in a way that only bureaucratic history can manage. With a settlement, the company agreed to pay compensation to the victims, families roughly 100 million Deutschmarks, in exchange for the charges being dropped. No one went to prison. No one was convicted. The court's reasoning was that the case was too complex, and the defendants had suffered enough through public attention, which is a polite German way of saying, "We're tired. Let's just stop." And so, they did. Grunenthal officially apologized, decades later, in 2012. Yes, 50 years after the disaster. The apology came from the company's CEO, who gave a brief, carefully worded speech in front of a memorial for thalidomide victims. He said they were very sorry, but stopped short of admitting actual guilt, because apparently, you can't rush closure. The survivors speak. For the families, life moved on, but never back to normal. The surviving children grew up with physical disabilities that required daily adjustments, prosthetic limbs, physical therapy, surgeries. Many developed remarkable independence. Some became public speakers and artists. Others lived quiet, private lives, away from the media. But all of them carried the same invisible burden, knowing they were part of a man-made catastrophe that should never have happened. In Germany, victims received small pensions from a trust fund set up by Grunenthal in the UK. Similar funds were created after public campaigns and lawsuits. Australia had its own legal battle that dragged on for decades. Some families didn't get any compensation until the 2010s. Imagine living your entire life with missing limbs, watching the company responsible thrive and expand, still making profits while your government negotiates whether your pain is worth another few $1,000s. That's the thalidomide legacy. The laws change. If there was one good thing that came out of the disaster, it was reform, slow, bureaucratic, and overdue, but reform nonetheless. Governments around the world suddenly realized they had no proper systems for evaluating new drugs. Companies could practically invent a pill, print a label, and sell it. So new regulations were introduced. In the US, the Kefauver-Harris Amendments of 1962 transformed the FDA. From then on, drug manufacturers had to prove both safety and effectiveness through rigorous trials before marketing any new drug. That's also when clinical testing Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3 became standardized. Europe followed suit with its own frameworks. Pregnant women were suddenly excluded from nearly all medical trials out of fear of repeating the tragedy, which, in a dark twist, meant that for decades afterward, most drugs were never properly tested for women at all. Medical science just quietly assumed the female body was the same as the male one, only smaller and moodier. So yes, thalidomide fixed one blind spot and created another. Meanwhile, in the shadows while Europe tried to heal, something strange was happening in Brazil. You see, thalidomide never fully disappeared. It just lingered. In some countries, leftover supplies continued being sold illegally through the 1970s and 80s, and in remote parts of South America, the drug quietly found a second life, this time as a treatment for leprosy. Doctors had noticed that thalidomide reduced inflammation in leprosy patients, particularly in cases of erythema nodosum leprosum, a painful skin condition. The effect was so dramatic that they started prescribing it widely. And yes, you can already guess what happened next. Pregnant women with leprosy, many of whom weren't warned about the risks, began giving birth to children with the same thalidomide deformities seen decades earlier in Europe. The cycle had repeated itself, in slow motion, across another continent. The comeback nobody asked for by the 1990s. Thalidomide made a full comeback this time, legally. Scientists rediscovered that the drug had powerful anti-inflammatory and immune-modulating effects. It could suppress certain immune responses and even slow the growth of blood vessels in tumors. So, pharmaceutical companies rebranded it as a targeted therapy for diseases like multiple myeloma, a type of cancer, and HIV-related complications. Of course, by then, everyone knew about its dark past, so strict safety measures were introduced. Patients taking thalidomide were required to use multiple forms of birth control, undergo regular pregnancy testing, and sign detailed consent forms. In a way, it became the most heavily supervised drug in modern medicine. The irony is that the same chemical once handed out to pregnant women like candy now required entire bureaucratic systems to keep it out of their hands. From villain to cure, there's something almost eerie about the idea of redemption through chemistry. Thalidomide, the destroyer of lives, now saving them. The same molecule that once caused unspeakable harm became a cornerstone in modern oncology. It's not forgiveness, just chemistry doing what chemistry does, neutral, uncaring. The moral weight lies in how people use it. For cancer patients, the drug really did extend life. In some cases, it helped when nothing else worked. And that complicated the narrative. Was thalidomide evil? Or was it just used recklessly by humans who wanted quick results and faster profits? Maybe both. Maybe neither. History, as usual, refuses to give us a neat answer. The human cost. The survivors who grew up with thalidomide disabilities eventually formed organizations to fight for justice and recognition. They called themselves thalidomiders. Their advocacy pushed for better compensation, improved accessibility, and more honest acknowledgement from the governments that failed them. Over time, many of them became public figures. People like Nick Dobrik and Matt Fraser, the latter a British actor who famously embraced his disability in his performances. They forced the world to look, not out of pity, but out of responsibility. They turned their bodies, once hidden from sight, into symbols of endurance and awareness. In interviews, many said the same thing, that their anger wasn't at the science, but at the arrogance, the assumption that safe could be declared without proof. That profit mattered more than precaution. And in that sense, thalidomide wasn't just a tragedy of biology. It was a tragedy of attitude, memory, and amnesia. By the early 21st century, thalidomide had mostly faded from the public consciousness. New scandals took its place. New drugs promised new miracles. The cycle continued. But the survivors were still there, aging, fewer in number each year. Some governments still issued annual payments. Some companies still faced lawsuits. The memorials stood quietly in parks and hospital gardens, with plaques reminding visitors of what went wrong. And then, in Arling, Grunenthal, SCO, gave that infamous apology speech. He stood beside a bronze statue of a child without limbs and said, "We ask for forgiveness that for nearly 50 years we didn't find the way to reach out to you from human being to human being." The victims in the audience didn't clap. Some turned away, some wept, others said nothing. Because really, what do you say to a company that took half a century to apologize? It was too little, too late, but still, perhaps, better than nothing. The legacy of a pill today, thalidomide, is a reminder of the thin line between medicine and poison. It reshaped global drug regulation. It taught scientists humility, or at least, it tried to. And it remains a permanent footnote in every pharmacology textbook. Never again. But the deeper lesson isn't about chemistry. It's about human nature, the tendency to rush, to believe, to trust authority, to assume safety when something feels convenient. Because thalidomide wasn't invented by monsters. It was invented by normal people doing their jobs, who cut corners, ignored warnings, and kept selling. It's a story not of evil, but of carelessness, which is somehow scarier. Next time, let us drift one layer deeper into that carelessness, into how the world's obsession with wonder drugs began long before thalidomide and never really ended. Because history doesn't repeat itself perfectly, it just rhymes. And sometimes, the rhyme sounds suspiciously familiar. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're refloating deeper into the world that made thalidomide possible. A world obsessed with miracle pills, shiny packaging, and the comforting illusion that science had everything under control. Because to really understand how thalidomide became a household name, you have to understand the culture that wanted it. A culture where doctors were gods, where advertising was science, and where pills were considered progress one swallow at a time. So, let's dim the lights again and drift into the mid-20th century, the age of convenience, the age of chemistry, the age of miracles, and the beginning of trouble. The post-war promise after World War II. The world was exhausted. Cities were rubble, economies were shaky, and everyone was just a little bit traumatized. But there was also optimism, the kind that comes after surviving something horrific. Science had just ended a world war. It had built planes, vaccines, penicillin, radar, and yes, the atomic bomb. The general mood was, if science can do that, what can't it do? And so, science became the new religion. The white lab coat replaced the priest's robe. The laboratory became a temple, and in that temple, pharmaceutical companies started making offerings, tiny, colorful tablets that promised to fix whatever ailed you. Got anxiety? There's a pill for that. Can't sleep? A pill. Indigestion, mood swings, restless legs. Have to. In the 1950s, this wasn't seen as over-medication. It was seen as progress. People genuinely believed they were living in a chemical utopia. Advertising as medicine, the marketing was genius. Pharmaceutical companies didn't just sell drugs, they sold identities. A calm mother, a confident businessman, a well-rested nurse. Every ad looked like a promise that life could finally be easy again. The tone was always cheerful, lots of smiling faces, babies, clean kitchens. The subtext was clear. Modern life might be stressful, but modern chemistry has your back. Thalidomide fit right into that narrative. It wasn't just a sedative. It was marketed as peace of mind in a pill, a symbol of control in a world that felt unpredictable. And when doctors saw the ads, they weren't skeptical. They were flattered. They were part of the modern miracle too, the friendly neighborhood gatekeepers of progress. It's easy to judge now, with hindsight and irony, but back then, this felt noble. They genuinely thought they were helping people live better, easier lives. The faith in the white coat doctors of the 1950s had immense social power. If your doctor said, "This is safe," you believed them. You didn't question it. Why would you? This was an era when people trusted authority by default. Governments, companies, experts. And in fairness, they'd just seen what unscientific chaos could do. So, when a doctor handed out a new pill, it felt like the safest thing in the world. Thalidomide's rise depended entirely on that trust. The company didn't have to prove much, they just had to look professional. They used words like clinical, tested, gentle, and non-toxic. No one asked how it was tested, or on what. If it came in a clean white box with German text and a reassuring slogan, that was enough. And so the drug spread, not through evidence, but through faith. The quiet gender divide. One detail often gets overlooked in this story. Thalidomide was targeted at women, specifically pregnant women. The ads weren't about curing disease, they were about managing mood, morning sickness, anxiety, nerves, all those vague feminine conditions that society didn't really take seriously but also wanted to keep quiet. Thalidomide promised to soothe without sedating, to make women calm, cooperative, and well-rested, the perfect mid-century ideal. It is no coincidence that many of the miracle drugs of the 1950s and 60s were aimed at women. Tranquilizers, sleeping pills, appetite suppressants, a pharmaceutical buffet designed to keep housewives functioning. Men got cigars and promotions. Women got Valium and thalidomide. That pattern didn't vanish after thalidomide either. It just got subtler. A pattern of belief when thalidomide was finally exposed. It wasn't just one company on trial. It was an entire mindset, the blind faith in chemical solutions. But the industry didn't stop. Within a few years, new drugs took its place. Valium became the next safe sedative. It was marketed again to mothers and housewives as mother's little helper. By the late 1960s, Valium was the most prescribed drug in the world. People hadn't learned to distrust the system. They'd just learned to distrust that pill. The pattern stayed. New pill, new promise, same faith. Even when antidepressants arrived in the 1980s and 90s, the messaging sounded familiar. A scientific fix for your sadness. Safe, effective, tested. Just like thalidomide had once been. History doesn't repeat, but the marketing departments definitely do. The long shadow after thalidomide, regulators became stricter, trials became longer. But there's a cost to every correction. Pregnant women were now excluded from almost all medical research. The intention was good, to protect them and their unborn children, but it created a gap in knowledge that still exists today. For decades, doctors prescribed drugs to pregnant women off-label, with no clear data on safety, because no one wanted to test anything on them ever again. The result, an entire generation of guesswork. The pendulum swung from reckless confidence to fearful avoidance. Thalidomide had turned the scientific world cautious, but not necessarily wiser. Cultural amnesia. By the 1970s, the world had started to forget. The photos of the thalidomide babies faded from newspapers. The lawsuits ended. The drugs evolved. People moved on, because that's what people do. Memory fades faster than trauma heals. In West Germany, the topic was uncomfortable. It clashed with the nation's ongoing attempt to rebuild moral credibility after the war. Many preferred not to talk about it. In Britain, it was treated as a tragic fluke, a reminder to trust science, but verify. And in the US, the story became a near-miss hero tale. Francis Kelsey, the vigilant FDA officer who saved the nation, it was framed as an American victory, not a global warning. The world managed to learn half the lesson. Be careful, but not too careful to slow down profits. The persistence of belief. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the pattern is still there. Every decade brings a new miracle, a new pill, a new treatment, a new molecule that will change everything. And every time, the advertising looks suspiciously familiar. Calm voices, white labs, confident doctors. We've just gotten better at the performance. Now it's clinical trials and peer-reviewed journals instead of trust us. It's safe. But the underlying message hasn't changed. Believe, consume, relax. And maybe that's why the thalidomide story still feels so relevant. It's not about the past. It's about how easily comfort turns into complacency. Science, without doubt. The saddest part is that the scientists behind thalidomide weren't villains. They weren't twirling mustaches in a lab, plotting harm. They were simply overconfident. They believed in their own expertise so completely that doubt seemed unnecessary. And in science, that's always where disaster begins, when curiosity ends and certainty takes over. The tragedy of thalidomide isn't just that it caused deformities, it's that it killed the idea of questioning authority. People trusted blindly, and that trust was weaponized by carelessness. The miracle addiction. The 20th century built its identity on miracle drugs, penicillin, insulin, antibiotics, vaccines. And to be fair, those were miracles. They saved millions of lives. But success breeds arrogance. The line between innovation and hubris blurred. If one pill could end infection, surely another could end sadness, pregnancy, nausea, or insomnia. Thalidomide was born out of that mindset, the belief that nature had finally been conquered, that chemistry had no limits. And when the consequences appeared, they were too shocking to process, because it meant the dream had cracks. No one likes to admit their faith is misplaced, especially when it wears a lab coat, a soft landing. By the late 20th century, thalidomide had become more than a scandal. It was a metaphor for blind trust, for human error, for the dark side of progress. It still shows up in medical ethics courses, whispered in lectures as a warning. Test everything, question everything, don't assume safety. But in the wider world, the memory feels faint. History doesn't vanish overnight. It just fades until someone makes a documentary about it, like this one you quietly listening to while drifting off to sleep. Because that's what humans do best. Forget just enough to repeat the same mistakes, with slightly better lighting. Next time, we'll float through the afterlife of thalidomide, how it became a case study for corporate ethics, how it reshaped law and medicine, and how survivors turned tragedy into advocacy. Because the story didn't end in the 1960s, it's still unfolding. Quietly, every time someone says, "Don't worry, it's perfectly safe." By the early 1960s, the thalidomide scandal had spread across continents. Newspapers that once ran cheerful pharmaceutical ads were now publishing photos of children with missing or malformed limbs. Families who had once proudly shared baby pictures were now hiding their children from public view, afraid of stares, whispers, and judgment. The scale of the disaster was staggering. Over 10,000 babies worldwide were born with severe deformities linked to thalidomide, and that's just the confirmed number. Experts believe the real total may have been closer to 20,000 or more, considering underreporting in countries that kept the issue quiet. But beyond numbers, there were individual lives, small, quiet tragedies in homes across Europe, Australia, Japan, and even Canada. Parents who had done everything right, followed doctors' advice, avoided alcohol, ate healthy, now found themselves caring for children who would face lifelong disabilities. Governments scrambled. Pharmaceutical companies pointed fingers. The West German firm Chemie Grunenthal, which had created thalidomide, insisted it had no idea the drug could cause harm. They claimed it had passed all required safety tests, which, to be fair, in the 1950s basically meant give it to a few mice and see if they fall over. Let's just say medical regulation was not exactly in its golden age. In the UK, the distributor Distillers Company, yes, the same company that made whiskey, faced a flood of lawsuits. In Germany, parents filed criminal charges against Grunenthal executives, accusing them of negligence and even manslaughter. But the legal process was agonizingly slow. The trial didn't even start until 1968, 7 years after the drug was withdrawn. And in that time, thousands of families had to fend for themselves. Most governments offered little to no support. Many children were placed in institutions. Some were abandoned. Others grew up with parents who adored them, but were overwhelmed by the lack of resources, medical care, or societal understanding. In West Germany, the press dubbed them Kontergan-Kinder, Kontergan children, after the German brand name of thalidomide. It sounds almost gentle, like a product line, but the reality was anything but. Now, here's where human nature steps in, not the heroic part, the bureaucratic one. For years, Grunenthal's lawyers fought every compensation claim. They argued that there was no conclusive proof that thalidomide alone caused the deformities, that it could have been genetics, or diet, or fate, anything but their product. Meanwhile, parents were holding their babies, staring at missing arms and flipper-like hands. wondering how anyone could deny what was in front of them. It wasn't until 1970, nearly a decade after the first warnings, that the German trial finally concluded. The verdict: the company and its executives were found guilty, but the court suspended the sentences, citing mitigating circumstances. Essentially, yes, you did it, but you know it was complicated. The families received compensation, but only after signing agreements promising not to pursue further legal action. The settlement totaled about 100 million Deutschmarks, distributed among thousands of victims. It helped, but it wasn't justice. It was damage control. In the UK, things weren't much better. Distillers Company paid out roughly £28 million in settlements. Again, it sounds like a lot, until you divide it among hundreds of victims and consider lifelong medical needs. In Australia, the first successful legal case didn't happen until the late 1970s. In Canada, families spent decades fighting for recognition. And in Japan, where the drug was sold under the name Isodorm, the scandal was hushed up so thoroughly that victims had to form their own support groups just to be heard. By the 1980s, thalidomide had become shorthand for pharmaceutical disaster, the ultimate cautionary tale. It changed how drugs were tested, labeled, and approved. In the US, the FDA's Francis Kelsey was hailed as a hero for having blocked the drug's approval, and new laws were passed to ensure drugs went through stricter trials. That's the silver lining, if you can call it that. But the story doesn't end with the 1960s, because thalidomide, like a bad penny, refused to disappear completely. While the Western world was busy condemning it, scientists in other countries started to notice something strange. Thalidomide still worked for certain conditions. It was an excellent sedative, it reduced inflammation, and it had an uncanny ability to calm the immune system. By the 1990s, thalidomide was quietly making a comeback, this time under new names, new branding, and supposedly stricter controls. It was being used to treat leprosy and multiple myeloma, a form of blood cancer. Yes, the same drug that once caused a generation of disabled children was now being marketed as a life-saving treatment. History, as always, has a dark sense of humor. But before we get to the drug's resurrection, let's stay a little longer with the people it left behind. Because the thalidomide children, now adults, didn't just vanish into statistics. They grew up, they built lives, and many of them, quite literally, reshaped the world around them. In Germany, Nico von Glasow, a thalidomide survivor born without arms, became a filmmaker. His 2005 documentary, Nobody's Perfect, featured other survivors posing nude, not for shock, but for truth. They wanted to show the human reality of what had been hidden away for decades. In the UK, campaigners like Matt Fraser used their art and activism to demand accountability. Fraser, an actor and musician, famously said that he was tired of being called an inspiration. What he wanted was justice and recognition, that this never should have happened in the first place. And in the 2000s, after decades of silence, some governments finally issued formal apologies. Germany did, the UK did, Canada eventually followed, but apologies don't regrow limbs. So let's drift now, gently, into the last part of this long, sad, circular story, where thalidomide, against all reason, rose again from its own ashes. Because history, it seems, can never resist recycling a bad idea, especially when there's money to be made. By the late 1980s, most people assumed thalidomide was gone for good. The drug had been banned almost everywhere, its name so toxic that even saying it out loud felt like invoking a curse. But medicine has a way of forgetting its own ghosts, especially when those ghosts start looking useful again. Somewhere in a small medical lab in Brazil, doctors treating leprosy patients noticed something unexpected. Thalidomide, which had once been used as a sedative, also reduced the painful skin lesions caused by a complication of leprosy, known as erythema nodosum. Leprosum. It worked remarkably well. Too well. Word spread fast, first through local clinics, then through research papers, then to pharmaceutical companies. Suddenly, the drug everyone swore off had a new reputation, a miracle for inflammation. It was almost poetic, the same phrase used to sell it in the 1950s, the miracle drug, only now it was being whispered again in hospitals and research journals. Of course, the scientists promised things would be different this time. Strict controls, limited use, no prescriptions for pregnant women, definitely no mass marketing. And yet, human error has a way of finding cracks in even the best intentions. In Brazil, where thalidomide use for leprosy became widespread, new cases of thalidomide-related birth defects started to appear decades after the original scandal. Doctors had prescribed it without adequate warnings. Patients shared pills with family members. Pharmacies sold it loosely. By the early 2000s, Brazil had documented hundreds of new thalidomide babies. The cycle had repeated. The world had learned nothing. Meanwhile, in wealthier countries, thalidomide was enjoying a quiet renaissance this time, under new management. In 1998, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration finally approved thalidomide again. Yes, the very same FDA that once rejected it. The approval came with heavy restrictions, requiring special registration systems, pregnancy testing, and warning labels large enough to fill half the packaging. The drug was rebranded under new names like Thalidomide, and it was marketed to treat multiple myeloma, a type of blood cancer. And to be fair, it worked. It saved lives. It also made enormous profits, because nothing sells like redemption, especially when you can attach a patent to it. The irony was thick. The same pharmaceutical logic that once destroyed lives was now congratulating itself for innovative use. Medical journals praised the revival of a controversial drug, as if the controversy was some abstract idea, not a generation of people who had to learn to button shirts with their feet. In interviews, many thalidomide survivors spoke about this comeback with mixed feelings. Some were genuinely glad that the drug could now help others. Others were angry, not because of its new uses, but because of the lack of closure, because the same companies that once denied responsibility were now quietly profiting again. The families had fought for decades to have their suffering acknowledged. Now, the drug that caused it was being hailed as a medical success story. One survivor called it like watching your abuser win an award. Thalidomide's modern use brought with it another strange twist. It inspired a whole new class of drugs. Chemists modified its structure to create derivatives called immunomodulatory drugs, IMDs, including lenalidomide and pomalidomide. These drugs worked even better against cancers like multiple myeloma, and thankfully, with lower risk of causing birth defects. But the irony remained. The darkest chapter in pharmaceutical history had paved the way for one of its most profitable new families of drugs. It's almost biblical. Out of destruction, new life. Out of tragedy, innovation. Out of human error, human profit. Meanwhile, the survivors continued aging, many in pain, many still fighting for medical coverage. Prosthetics, surgeries, accessibility equipment, all expensive. All reminders of a mistake that wasn't theirs. In Erling Grunenthal, the German company behind thalidomide, finally issued a formal apology. Its CEO stood in front of cameras, voice trembling slightly, saying the company was truly sorry. It would have been more convincing if it hadn't come 50 years late. Worse, the company had still never admitted legal liability. It was a PR apology, not a legal one. A gesture for the record books. Outside the press conference, thalidomide survivors stood silently, holding photos of their younger selves, the babies who had paid for that apology with their bodies. When asked for comment, one survivor reportedly said, "They waited until most of us were dead. Let's float a little wider now, away from courtrooms and pills, and into the larger moral landscape." Thalidomide changed more than just pharmaceutical law. It changed how we think about trust. Before thalidomide, medicine was seen as infallible. White coats, Latin names, miracle cures. After it, the world learned that science without ethics can be just as dangerous as ignorance. It also changed how pregnant women were treated in medicine. For the first time, they were considered not just patients, but a special category, one where every pill, every procedure, every test had to be weighed against unseen risks. Today, every time you read "not for use during pregnancy" on a label, you can thank thalidomide for that small warning. It's written in the ink of tragedy. And yet, somehow, despite all this, the story isn't over. Even now, in the 2020s, thalidomide is still being prescribed carefully. Yes, but still, it's used for leprosy, certain cancers, and rare autoimmune diseases. And every few years, in some part of the world, a new case surfaces. A baby born with telltale limb deformities. A mother who never got the warning. The nightmare that was supposed to end in 1961 keeps flickering back to life, like a bad signal that refuses to fade. When you zoom out far enough, thalidomide stops being just a drug story. It becomes a mirror, a reflection of how humans chase progress, sometimes blindly, How we balance the urge to heal with the temptation to profit. How history repeats itself, not because we forget, but because we convince ourselves that this time we're smarter, and maybe we are. But every warning label, every regulation, every safety test written into modern medicine, all of it whispers the same quiet message. Remember Thalidomide. The next time you hear a pharmaceutical ad promising miracles, think of a small white pill that promised the same thing 70 years ago. It made people sleep better, it made companies rich, and it changed the world, one missing limb at a time.